April 27th, 1945. The end of an era. In the back of a retreating German truck, a man huddled in the shadows. He pulled an oversized steel helmet low over his eyes. A heavy Wehrmacht coat hid his uniform. He was shaking. This was not an ordinary soldier. This was the man who once commanded the absolute loyalty of 44 million Italians. Why was the dictator hiding like a thief? He had armies and gold, but the fear of the partisans was stronger than his pride. The convoy moved slowly toward the Swiss border. Engines roared. The smell of exhaust fumes filled the air. Just hours earlier, he had been the untouchable ruler of Italy. Now, he was cargo, a fugitive whose life hung by a thread. At first glance, a defeated unit, but in reality, a hearse for the fascist regime. That is the anatomy of Benito Mussolini's final 24 hours. It was a collapse of biblical proportions. It would not end with the glory he always craved. It would end in a small village square. The witnesses were not diplomats or generals. They were ordinary Italians who had suffered under his iron boot for over 2 decades. Events moved fast. What transpired between the dawn of the 27th and the afternoon of the 28th? It remains one of the most brutal conclusions to any reign in modern history. The footage shows chaos in the streets, confusion. Did he beg for mercy in those final seconds? Did he show remorse for the ruin he brought upon his nation? And finally, the question of the body. Why was it displayed like meat in a public square? The location was not random. It was the exact spot where his regime had executed innocent civilians just months before. The morning of April 27th arrived. April 27th, 1945. The morning sun rose over the small town of Como. Why did the once mighty Duce hide in the back of a truck? He had commanded millions, but now fear was his only advisor. Benito Mussolini was running. The destination was neutral Switzerland. But the Allied forces were not just pursuing him, they were hunting him. Milan had fallen days ago. The Americans were coming from the south. The British were closing the net. For the dictator, this was not a strategic retreat. It was the final roll of the dice. Just 3 weeks earlier, the scene had been different. Mussolini sat at his headquarters. He moved pins on a map. He argued with German officials. He pretended his government still had a pulse. But the puppet state he created in northern Italy was a corpse. German paratroopers had rescued him in 1943. But no one was coming to save him now. The front collapsed. German units retreated north. Partisan fighters emerged from every shadow. The war was lost. The convoy that morning looked like a traveling circus of the desperate. Hardened German SS officers sat next to Italian fascist ministers. These men had stayed loyal to the end. Now they regretted it. Their wives sat beside them. Hands clutched leather bags filled with jewelry and deeds. It was the only currency they had left. The camera records, children pressing their faces against the cold glass of the vehicles. They do not understand the panic. They only see the terror in their parents' eyes. Mussolini took extreme measures. He stripped off his fascist uniform. He discarded the medals in the sash. In their place, he put on a heavy German greatcoat. He pulled a steel Wehrmacht helmet low over his eyes. He hoped the disguise would turn him into a ghost. He needed to pass through the partisan checkpoints as a nameless soldier. The transformation was practical, but it was also a symbol of total defeat. At first glance, a tired German conscript, but in reality, the architect of Italian fascism. Decades of propaganda evaporated in that truck bed. This was the man who had stood on Roman balconies. He had jutted his jaw. He had screamed about glory to roaring crowds. He had posed for thousands of photos to project absolute strength. Now, he hunched his shoulders. He made himself small. He hid behind foreign insignia. His mistress, Clara Petacci, did not ride with him. She sat in a separate car with other refugees. She had money. She had connections. She could have fled alone weeks ago, but she refused every offer. She insisted on sharing the fate of the man she had loved for 10 years. Events accelerated. The convoy hugged the western shore of Lake Como. The road was narrow and winding. This route was the primary artery for the retreat. Countless refugees had used this path to flee the Allied advance. The lake was once a playground. Elegant villas lined the water. Italy's wealthy elite used to vacation here. Now, the asphalt served as an escape corridor for the defeated. As the vehicles climbed north into the mountains, the tension spiked. Reports crackled over the radio. Partisan roadblocks were ahead. Then came worse news. Rumors spread through the convoy. The Swiss border guards were closing the gates. Switzerland had stayed neutral for the entire war. But now, the country was overwhelmed. Thousands of fascists and German officials were trying to cross. Swiss authorities issued a new order. Only essential personnel could enter. They began turning people away. Mussolini's name was not on the list of allowed refugees. The noose tightened. In the frame, the jagged peaks of the Alps. They looked close enough to touch, but they were miles away. Everyone in the convoy understood the stakes. Capture did not mean prison, it meant execution. The partisan movement had made their intentions public. Leaflets dropped from planes. Radio broadcasts repeated the message. Fascist leaders would face immediate justice. There would be no trials. There would be no negotiations. There would be no mercy. The German officers leading the convoy assessed the situation. They looked at the maps. They looked at their fuel gauges. Their priority was not Mussolini. Their priority was survival. The footage shows officers whispering in small groups. They glance at the Italian trucks, then look away. Loyalty was a luxury they could no longer afford. The Third Reich was collapsing. Hitler was trapped in his bunker in Berlin. These officers had families waiting in Germany. They considered abandoning the dictator on the side of the road. If dumping Mussolini meant saving their own skins, they would do it. But time ran out for schemes. Midday, April 27th. The convoy rounded a curve near the village of Dongo. The lead truck slammed on its brakes. A wooden barrier blocked the road. Men with red scarves and submachine guns stepped out from the trees. The trap was sprung. 24 hours remained in the life of Benito Mussolini. The countdown began at a partisan checkpoint near the village of Dongo. The road was blocked by the 52nd Garibaldi Brigade. These were not professional soldiers in polished boots. They were farmers with calloused hands, factory workers covered in oil, students who had traded textbooks for rifles. Hatred united them. They despised the regime that had turned their country into a graveyard. Many had buried brothers killed by blackshirts. Others bore scars from the secret police dungeons. They did not just want victory. They wanted revenge. The rumble of heavy engines broke the silence. A German convoy appeared around the bend. At first, the partisans lowered their barrels. German trucks were a common sight on these routes. The resistance fighters had orders to hunt Italian fascists, not to engage the Wehrmacht in a suicide mission. They prepared to wave the vehicles through. Why did the plan change? Lazzaro saw what others missed. Urbano Lazzaro was a partisan leader with prior military service. He watched the trucks roll closer. At first glance, a standard German unit retreating north, but in reality, a desperate masquerade. Lazzaro noticed the details. The soldiers looked too stiff. Their helmets sat awkwardly on their heads, sweat beaded on their foreheads despite the biting chill of the mountain air. These men were terrified. Lazzaro knew something was wrong. Hours earlier, the radio had crackled with a warning. High-value targets were on the move. Headquarters demanded total scrutiny, every truck, every face, every paper. Lazzaro raised his hand. The convoy halted with a screech of brakes. The partisans swarmed the vehicles. Fingers hovered over triggers. They barked commands in Italian and broken German. The real Wehrmacht officers remained calm. They presented stamped travel permits with mechanical precision. But the men in the back of the trucks froze. Events accelerated. The disguised Italians began to crack. Under the pressure of gun barrels, their act fell apart. One official had pulled a German greatcoat over his uniform, but forgot to remove his fascist lapel pins. Another tried to speak, but his accent was pure Italian. The footage shows a man's hands tremble violently. He was asked for identification. Panic took over. The papers slipped from his grip and scattered across the asphalt. Among the German permits lay Italian identity cards. There was no mistake. The most damaging evidence came seconds later. A partisan peered into the truck and locked eyes with a man wearing bandages. The suspect claimed it was a fresh war wound, but the partisan knew that face. He knew the voice. This was a fascist official known for brutalizing local civilians. The scar was not from battle. It was a mark of identity. The trap had snapped shut. 20 years of absolute power collapsed in a single second. During the tense inspection of the German convoy, one partisan spotted a detail that did not belong. Giuseppe Negri looked into the back of the truck and froze. He knew that face. He had seen it on propaganda posters, in school classrooms, and on public buildings since the day he was born. Why did the disguise fail? The fugitive wore a German helmet and a heavy coat to hide his identity. But he could not hide the square jaw and the heavy, penetrating eyes. Negri whispered the truth. The name Mussolini cut through the noise of the idling engines like a knife. The shockwave was immediate. Fighters who had spent years hunting shadows in the mountains suddenly found themselves staring at the architect of their suffering. They were face to face with the enemy. But this was only the beginning. Mussolini saw the recognition in their eyes. He did not run. Instead, he attempted one final desperate act of theater. He threw off the hunch of a tired soldier. He straightened his shoulders. He tried to inflate his chest and summon the terrifying presence that had once commanded millions from the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia. He wanted to be Il Duce one last time. The visual evidence paints a pathetic picture. Witnesses describe a man trying to project power that had long since evaporated. The glare that once terrified ministers now looked manic. The gestures that hypnotized crowds seemed jerky and desperate. At first glance, a defiant leader. But in reality, a frightened old man shivering in an ill-fitting coat. The magic was dead. The context of the war had stripped him of his aura. To the partisans, he was no longer a demigod. He was simply a target. The capture was violent and precise. Partisans surrounded the truck. The sound of safety catches clicking off echoed down the line. They screamed orders. Weapons were trained on the occupants. The passengers were dragged out onto the cold road. They were now the most valuable prisoners in the history of the Italian resistance. Events accelerated. Colonel Hans Fallmeyer, the German commander, made a cold calculation. He immediately stepped away from the Italian group. He produced documents. He pointed to official stamps. He insisted his unit was merely providing humanitarian transport. The footage of history is clear here. The German officer physically distanced himself from his former ally. The partnership of steel and blood ended not on a battlefield, but in a ditch, with a bureaucrat checking his papers. The search continued. In a trailing vehicle, partisans found a woman, Clara Petacci. She had refused to leave the dictator's side. Her capture removed any lingering doubt. This was not a decoy. This was the inner circle. News of the arrest moved faster than the convoy ever could. It spread like a contagion through the network. Runners sprinted down mountain paths. Radio operators in hidden basements tapped out urgent coded bursts. "We have him!" The message electrified the resistance command across northern Italy. But the victory brought immediate danger. The partisans now held a live grenade. They possessed the most wanted man on the continent. The Americans were racing north. The fascists were regrouping. The mob was waiting. The resistance leaders had to make a decision before the situation spiraled out of control. Time had run out. April 27th. Darkness covered the village of Bonzanigo. Benito Mussolini found himself trapped in a small farmhouse, waiting for the end. The man who had controlled the fate of millions for 2 decades now faced the most powerless night of his life. The farmhouse was modest. It was cramped. The walls were rough stone. The furniture was basic wood. At first glance, a simple peasant dwelling, but in reality, the final cage for a fallen dictator. This was a sharp contrast to the palaces of his past. The Villa Torlonia in Rome, where he lived as prime minister, had marble floors and grand halls. Here, there was only cold dust. The atmosphere was suffocating. The partisans selected this location with military precision. It was remote. It was hidden. German patrols would never find it here. Yet, the local command structure was close enough for rapid communication. The farmhouse belonged to a family broken by fascist policies. They were not just hosts, they were reliable jailers. Why did they agree to hide him? It wasn't for money, it was for revenge. Mussolini was confined to a single small room. He was not alone. Clara Petacci sat with him. Outside the door, armed partisans stood guard. They did not see a former head of state. They saw a war criminal responsible for countless executions and immeasurable suffering. The guards rotated throughout the night. They checked their weapons. They kept their eyes open. Inside the room, the Duce's behavior was erratic. He swung between desperate attempts at dignity and moments of visible terror. He paced the floor. 4 steps forward, 4 steps back. He adjusted his coat. He checked his watch. His hands shook. The man who had negotiated with Hitler as an equal now trembled before farmers and factory workers. He had once dismissed these people as unimportant masses. Now they held his life in their hands. He tried to talk. He needed them to listen. Sometimes he appealed to their nationalism. He spoke of the land Italy gained under his rule. He listed the buildings. He mentioned the modern roads. The guards remained silent. Desperation took over. He changed his tactics. He tried to bargain. He offered secrets. He spoke of hidden fascist gold buried in the north. He promised to reveal the locations of other fleeing officials. "I can help you," he insisted. "I have information." But the partisans remained stone. His pleas meant nothing. They had seen too much horror. They remembered the violence. Many of them had lost brothers and fathers in the fighting. Others had witnessed brutal attacks on civilians. Mussolini's words could not erase the memory of 20 years of blood. The presence of Clara Petacci added a different layer of tension. She had chosen to stay. She had opportunities to flee. She could have escaped separately. Instead, she chose this room. Her loyalty was absolute. It was also fatal. The partisans debated her fate in low voices, what to do with her. Some argued she was a victim of circumstance. They said she was caught in events beyond her control. Others disagreed. They insisted she was part of the crimes. She had been the dictator's companion for years. She offered symbolic support to the regime. The scene was stark. A woman who had lived in luxury, attending elaborate social functions, now sat on a hard chair in a peasant's house. She had enjoyed the protection of power. Now, that connection made her a target. Throughout the night, Petacci tried to comfort Mussolini. She touched his arm. She whispered quiet words. She fought her own fear. But the reality was undeniable. The sun would rise soon. There was no escape route left. There was no turning back. 3 a.m. At this hour, the telegraph lines across northern Italy were burning hot. Couriers sprinted between safe houses. Radio operators tapped out coded sequences with sweating hands. The capture of Mussolini was not simply a victory. It was a logistical nightmare. The partisans had achieved the impossible. They had the man who plunged Italy into 20 years of darkness, but now a massive problem sat in their lap. What do you do with a fallen dictator? This decision would echo far beyond the stone walls of his temporary prison. Why was the command terrified? They had the prize, but holding a tiger by the tail is often deadlier than hunting it. The partisan headquarters turned into a battlefield of words. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and shouting. One faction slammed their fists on the table. They demanded a public trial. They wanted a courtroom. They wanted a glass cage. They wanted the world to hear the crimes listed one by one. To them, this was vital. A trial would grant the resistance legitimacy. It would prove they were an army of law, not a mob of killers. They wanted history written in ink, not blood. But the other side shook their heads. Time was the enemy. They pointed to the maps. German units were still active. Fascist loyalists were regrouping. A rescue attempt could happen at any second. And then there were the Allies. The Americans and British were advancing rapidly. If the Allies arrived, they would take Mussolini. He would vanish into the international court system. He might survive for years. The practical military reality demanded speed. It demanded a bullet. At first glance, a strategic debate, but in reality, a war for the soul of the future Italy. The rift ran deep. Communist brigades demanded immediate revolutionary justice. To them, execution was a hygiene measure, a way to ensure the infection of fascism never returned. Moderate liberals hesitated. They wanted to build a democracy. Executing a prisoner without trial set a dangerous precedent for the new republic. But the clock did not care about political theory. But this was only the beginning. The net was catching more than just the big fish. Reports flooded in from the checkpoints. The entire fascist hierarchy was collapsing like a house of cards. Alessandro Pavolini was dragged out of an armored car near Bergamo. He was the fanatic, the organizer of the puppet state. He did not escape. Achille Stouris was intercepted near Como. The man known for brutal enforcement of ideology was now a prisoner of the people he terrorized. The resistance had swept the board. The government was gone. In the farmhouse, the prisoner waited. The footage of memory describes the scene. A small room, a wooden chair, a single light bulb. Mussolini did not sleep. He sensed the walls closing in. The partisans guarding him noted every movement. The former dictator oscillated between arrogance and terror. One moment, he raised his chin. He insisted that history would vindicate him. He claimed his empire was necessary. Then, the mood shifted. He slumped. He spoke of regret. He did not talk about politics, but about human cost. He mentioned the blood. He mentioned the ruins. But mostly, he spoke of his family. He asked about Vittorio, his eldest son, a man of cinema and propaganda. He asked about Etta. The name carried a heavy weight. Etta was the widow of Galeazzo Ciano. Mussolini had ordered Ciano's execution for treason. He had killed the father of his own grandchildren. Now, facing his own end, that ghost stood in the room with him. The camera records, a man aged 10 years in a single night. His hands tremble, his eyes dart to the door at every sound. Philosophy meant nothing now. As the sky turned gray in the east, the arguments in the headquarters ceased. The partisan leadership looked at the clock. April 28th had arrived. The risk of a rescue was too high. The risk of American interference was too great. The sentence was passed without a gavel. The debate was over. The cars were prepared. The engine of history revived for one final turn. Dawn broke on April 28th. April 28th, 1945. Dawn broke over the mountains with a heavy, cold certainty. The night had been consumed by urgent whispered meetings among the partisan commanders. By sunrise, the verdict was absolute. There would be no courtroom drama, no lawyers, no transfer to Allied custody where the dictator might find a loophole. The decision was final. Why did the partisans choose immediate execution? The Americans were advancing rapidly. If the Allies took custody, Mussolini might become a prisoner of war, a symbol, or a rallying point for surviving fascists. The resistance needed a corpse, not a defendant. The man assigned to pull the trigger was Walter Audizio. In the files, he was known as Colonel Valerio, a communist partisan who had spent years fighting in the shadows. He didn't just accept the order, he embraced it. He had watched friends die in fascist torture chambers. He had seen the regime bleed his country dry. For Audizio, this wasn't a military operation. It was a reckoning. Audizio gathered a small, lethal team and drove to the farmhouse in Bonzanigo. There was no hesitation. The war was still raging on the plains below, and time was their enemy. Every minute Mussolini remained alive was a risk the National Liberation Committee refused to take. When Audizio kicked open the door to the room holding Mussolini and Clara Petacci, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The former dictator looked up. He saw the expression on Colonel Valerio's face and understood. This wasn't a transfer. Audizio spoke clearly. He informed Mussolini that the death sentence had been passed. The reaction was visceral. Mussolini didn't accept his fate with stoicism. He panicked. He began to negotiate. He spoke rapidly, offering the locations of hidden gold reserves. He promised to give up the coordinates of fleeing fascist officials. He begged. The man who had once commanded legions was now trading secrets for breath, but Audizio stood like a statue. He didn't want the gold. He didn't care about the secrets. The Court of Revolutionary Justice had closed its session. Clara Petacci's fate was sealed in the same breath. She held no official rank. She signed no execution orders. But in the eyes of the partisans, she was the regime's shadow. Her presence was a symbol of the excess and corruption that had destroyed Italy. She pleaded for mercy. But the men in that room had seen too many atrocities to feel pity. Events accelerated. Audizio ordered his men to move the prisoners. They shoved Mussolini and Petacci into a waiting vehicle. The engine roared to life. At first glance, a simple transport operation, but in reality, the funeral procession of Italian fascism. The drive was short. a matter of minutes winding through the narrow mountain roads near Lake Como. Inside the car, silence reigned. Mussolini stared out the window. 23 years of absolute power were dissolving into the gray afternoon. He wasn't going to Rome. He wasn't going to a palace. He was going to a dead end. The vehicle stopped at the Villa Belmonte in Giuliano di Mezzegra. It was 4:10 in the afternoon. The location was chosen for tactical reasons. It was a quiet residential street. Privacy was key. A public square would draw a crowd too quickly. A major road risked Allied interception. Here, the stone walls offered seclusion. Duce ordered them out. He positioned them against the villa's iron gate. The scene records: a modest suburban street, well-kept gardens, a damp stone wall, the mundane backdrop for a historic collapse. Mussolini tried to compose himself. Witnesses later described a man fighting a losing battle with his own biology. He stood straight, puffing out his chest, attempting to summon the image of Il Duce. But the facade cracked. His hands trembled uncontrollably. His eyes darted around, filled with raw animal fear. Petacci was in a state of total shock. She seemed unable to process the reality of the wall and the guns. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to scream, but there was no time. Duce didn't wait for a final speech. He raised his weapon. The submachine gun jammed. He grabbed another weapon from a fellow partisan. He aimed. The shots rang out, dry, loud cracks that echoed off the villa walls. Mussolini collapsed instantly. Petacci fell beside him. The man who had shaped the destiny of millions, who had sent armies into the desert and the snow, was dead in seconds. There was no ceremony, no last words, just the smell of gunpowder and the silence of the street. The partisan commander moved forward. He verified the deaths with a cold, professional glance. Then the orders came. Load them up. This was not the end of the operation. The bodies were not to be buried here. The partisans knew that a rumor of death was not enough. The Italian people, traumatized by decades of lies, needed to see the flesh and bone. They needed visual proof that the nightmare was over. The soldiers hoisted the bodies into the back of the vehicle. The convoy sped away towards Milan. Behind them, on the street in Giuliano di Mezzegra, only a few bloodstains remained on the wet ground. The next rain would wash them away. For a few hours, the location was just a quiet street again, but the news was already traveling through the wires. Resistance networks lit up. By evening, every partisan unit in northern Italy knew the truth. Il Duce was gone. The era was dead. April 29, 1945. Dawn broke over Milan with a grim revelation. In the early morning grayness, a truck arrived at Piazzale Loreto and dumped its cargo onto the damp pavement. The cargo was human. Benito Mussolini, his mistress Clara Petacci, and other high-ranking fascist leaders lay in a disorganized heap. They were not treated with dignity. They were discarded like trash. News of the display did not just travel, it detonated. Word raced through the neighborhoods of Milan like a shockwave. Within minutes, the streets filled with running footsteps. Why did the people run? For over 2 decades, they had waited for this moment. It was an explosion of public emotion. Italians who had lived under the boot of oppression, who had buried family members killed by the regime, finally saw a concrete symbol. The suffering was over. The war was ending. The crowd surged into Piazzale Loreto. It represented every stratum of Italian society that had bled under Mussolini's rule. The scene turned chaotic instantly. The footage shows a mass of bodies pushing against each other, fighting for a glimpse of the center, people shoved forward. They needed to see the man who had dominated their lives for so long. Many could not believe the dictator was truly dead. They needed physical proof. It wasn't enough to look. Some spat on the corpses, others kicked the lifeless bodies. The sound of shouting and cursing drowned out everything else. Many simply stared. They stood in stunned silence, eyes fixed on the cold concrete. Fascism in Italy had finally ended, and the proof lay at their feet. But this display served a purpose beyond simple revenge. For the partisan movement, it was a message. It provided unmistakable evidence of their success. They had achieved their primary mission, the total elimination of fascist leadership. For ordinary Italians, it offered psychological freedom. They saw with their own eyes that the man they had been taught to fear and worship was nothing more than a mortal human being. He was flesh and bone. he was dead. The crowd's behavior reflected the complex history of the nation. At first glance, a mob seeking blood, but in reality, a population reckoning with its past. Some of those gathered in the square had once cheered Mussolini enthusiastically during his rise in the 1920s. Others had supported the imperial adventures in Ethiopia. They had backed the early years of World War II. Now, faced with the corpses of their leaders, the mood shifted. Many experienced a mixture of shame, relief, and angry satisfaction. There was no mistake in the location. The choice of Piazzale Loreto was deeply symbolic and intentional. Why this specific square? Why not a prison or a government building? Because the fascists had used it first. Just months earlier, this same square had been the site of a horrible display created by the regime. The bodies of 15 executed partisans had been left there. It was a warning to anyone considering resistance. The decision to display Mussolini's body here was revenge in its most literal sense. The square witnessed the reversal of brutality. The bodies of the regime's leaders replaced the bodies of their victims. Events accelerated as the sun rose higher. International journalists arrived on the scene. They described it as one of the most dramatic endings to any dictatorship in modern history. The camera records, flashbulbs popping, reporters scribbling furiously in notebooks. The images captured that day were sent around the world. They provided visual confirmation that another Axis leader had met his end. For Allied forces still fighting in other sectors, these photographs served as powerful propaganda. They showed one thing clearly: victory over fascism was both possible and inevitable. The display continued throughout the morning. The crowds grew larger, the noise grew louder. Milan's residents were joined by people from surrounding areas. They traveled to the city specifically to witness this historic moment. The square became a pilgrimage site for anyone who had suffered. They wanted to see the end of their oppressor. But the situation began to turn. As the day went on, the energy in the square shifted from celebration to danger. Both Italian authorities and Allied military commanders watched the swelling numbers with concern. The crowd was becoming too large. The anger was too raw. There was a potential for the situation to spiral completely out of control. Authority had to be restored. Late afternoon, April 29, 1945, Allied military jeeps cut through the crowd to reach Piazzale Loreto. The exhibition had to end. Soldiers pushed back the spectators. They cut the ropes. The bodies fell heavily onto the truck beds. There was no ceremony. The remains were driven away and buried in unmarked graves. The physical spectacle was over, but the psychological shockwave was just beginning. Was this rough justice or mob violence? The debate erupted immediately, but there was no consensus. Some argued the execution was necessary. A dictator who showed no mercy to his victims deserved none in return. Others disagreed. They argued for a live capture. They wanted an international tribunal. They wanted a full legal record of fascist crimes. But the partisans did not have the luxury of time. The timeline was compressed into 72 lethal hours. April 27th, capture. April 28th, execution. April 29th, public display. Events moved at a breakneck speed. Northern Italy was in chaos. Partisan commanders made split-second decisions based on immediate survival and political necessity. They ignored legal precedents. They ignored long-term history. For the resistance movement, the elimination of the leader was the only goal that mattered. At first glance, an invincible totalitarian state, but in reality, a fragile regime vulnerable to determined opposition. The underground networks proved this fact to the world. Even the most established dictatorship could be dismantled by popular force. This realization crossed borders. It fueled resistance movements in other nations still crushed under fascist boots. The international reaction was swift. Winston Churchill made a statement. He expressed grim satisfaction that a primary enemy of Britain was gone. American officials agreed. To them, the news confirmed one thing: the war in Europe was collapsing. But in Italy, the silence followed the noise. The country faced a ruinous reality. It wasn't just about rebuilding bombed bridges or factories. The political system was rot. Decades of authoritarian rule had poisoned the social fabric. The healing process would take generations, but the image remained. The footage of the corpse hanging in Piazzale Loreto became a permanent historical marker. It was a warning to tyrants. It was proof that power is not eternal. It inspired those who needed the courage to rebel. The location of the execution, Giuliano di Mezzegra, transformed as well. It became a site of historical analysis. Visitors arrived at the spot not to mourn the dictator. They came to understand the mechanics of the fall. They came to remember the ordinary Italians who pulled the trigger. The final 24 hours of Benito Mussolini's life serve as a case study in total collapse. He started as the Duce, who promised to restore the ancient Roman Empire. He ended as a fugitive disguised in a German soldier's greatcoat, trembling in a convoy. He led Italy into disastrous campaigns and aligned with the Nazis. Now he was stripped of all pretense. The camera records, a man paralyzed by fear. There were no dramatic gestures. There were no balcony speeches. There was only desperation and ultimate helplessness. He faced forces he could no longer control. The era of fascism died in the dirt.